Hi everyone, thanks for joining our webcast. Today we're pleased to present What's the Role of Leaders in Continuous Innovation? I'm Melissa Moore, Executive Producer of the Lean Startup Conference, happening December 8 to 12 in San Francisco. Visit leanstartup.co for more information. Our speakers today are Brant Cooper, Carie Davis, and Sarah Milstein. Brant Cooper helps organizations big and small innovate. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Lean Entrepreneur, and is a sought-after speaker, startup advisor, and mentor. Carie Davis is the Global Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Coca-Cola, where she has engaged 1,000 associates in building their entrepreneurial skills. She also leads Coca-Cola's partnership with Up Global to engage with startup ecosystems. Sarah Milstein, CEO of Lean Startup Production and co-host of the Lean Startup Conference, will moderate this discussion. A few reminders. We'll take questions from the audience via the live chat. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the question box to flag it. The speakers will answer questions in the second half of the webcast. No need to ask your questions twice. This webcast will last 45 minutes to an hour, and the recording will be available a few days after. Take it away, Sarah.
All right, thank you so much, Melissa. I'm so glad to be here today and to have Carie and Brant with us. A lot of our webcasts have focused on things like Lean Startup 101 or introducing Lean Startup in a mission-driven organization. They've been really about the basics. And I'm particularly excited today that we get to go a little deeper and look at a more advanced topic in trying to understand continuous innovation, not just where do we start, but how do we keep it going. That said, I do want to start with a definition and make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So briefly, Brant and Carie, I'd like to ask both of you, what do we mean by continuous innovation? And Carie, if you could start and talk about how you think about that and what it means for Coke, that would be great.
Yeah, continuous innovation for what I'm looking at is really what is the day-to-day. We have a few different groups who are focused on adjacent opportunities and things like that. When people are exploring emerging opportunities, or even just the people who don't have innovation in their title, and they're just trying a little bit better. So they're looking at a customer, maybe it's an internal customer or an external customer, and they're just trying to solve a problem for them.
Right, okay. Thank you. Brant, anything you want to add to that? How do you think about continuous innovation?
So I'm a big fan of Clayton Christensen, Innovator's Dilemma, and of course we all know by now he defined sustaining technology versus disruptive technology. We talk about innovation more broadly because innovation doesn't have to happen just in technology. We view this as a continuum, and so there really is, much like what Carie was saying, the day-to-day innovation all the way through breakthrough innovation. To be frank, most of the organizations that we work with are developing their muscles and exercising their muscles, more tending towards the sustaining innovation side, and I think that's great. I think the hope is then that they're able to start experimenting outside of the local maximum and thereby finding more breakthrough innovation. But I think that there's, we sort of all know the meta happening in the world with the speed that we're moving and the transformation, and I think what we're finding is that, again, as Carie is saying, in order to discover new opportunities, problems that need to be solved, we need to understand our customers deeply, and we have to move faster, and I think that that's where we see a lot of the uptake in lean startup practices.
So is it fair to say then that when we talk about continuous innovation, that's covering both that disruptive and sustaining innovation?
That's right.
Okay. Okay, good. It's like a lot of buzzwords, but I want to make sure we're talking about the same stuff. All right, so what's the role of leaders? I want to understand, that's really what we're here to talk about today. We can, there's lots of ways we can define it, and we can give lots of examples. But we're particularly interested in the role of leaders who can really help make things happen and also keep things moving. So actually this time, Brant, I'd like to start with you in talking about how you see the role of managers and leaders in a process toward continuous innovation.
I'm still discovering that exactly, but what's amazing to me is how much I get to learn sort of in a day in, day out basis. I think that for all the practitioners out there in the audience, they know what the first definition is. The first need is for leaders to change how they're measuring their innovation practices. So it's not just based upon what's going to be the return on my investing in this innovation and when am I going to see that return. It has to be sort of along Eric's validated learning. The accounting has to be different. But one of the things that I find really interesting in all of this, and it's almost sort of aside from lean startup, is that we're actually asking leaders to behave in fundamentally different ways. They have to be mentors in ways that mentoring hasn't meant the same thing in these organizations in the past, where it might have been around, career advice or, helping people become better managers themselves. And what we're really finding now is that it's more like mentoring out in the startup world. The leaders themselves need to have a tremendous amount of empathy for the teams that they're helping out, and they have to be able to push back and hold them accountable, but also help them to figure out when to persevere and not just pivot or to pivot. So you're actually, in some ways, leaders have to be encouraging the ability to fail, which of course, is very difficult in these large established companies where they've been optimized for success. They've been optimized for following processes that are inside of a known market.
Yeah, I want to come back to that question of pivoting and failing, what that means in a big organization. But first I'd like to hear, Carie, how do you think about that role of leaders in supporting innovation?
Yeah, so something that we started out kind of when we got not the mandate, but the suggestion that we try to expose people working on core business innovation and just core business challenges to entrepreneurial ways of working. It was one specific leader, and I think it was kind of an experiment. So we wanted to see if we could even do it. Would people get it? So that was sort of the idea behind, let's just expose as many people as possible, having a goal of 1,000. And something that I realized pretty quickly is you can get, the kind of participate in the things that we're doing. They get really excited, and maybe you have about 10% of those people who actually are able to take it forward. And ideally, some of those people are leaders who are saying, I want to implement this in my function or business unit, because that's where we've seen the best results. It's a lot more difficult, certainly, embraces the methods to take it back to their team. So you're up against those challenges. It takes the leaders who can see, I need to work faster. I need people to be inspired and empowered, and this is a way we could do that. Brant said about, you have to change the reward mechanisms, because if you tell a leader of a new group who maybe isn't immediately on board, you have to start giving people some runway to explore things, and you don't have to give them a whole lot of budget, but you've got to give them a different, you've got to give them some flexibility and just bring you evidence to explore some weird challenges and weird opportunities. Why would they do that if they don't have the reward mechanism set up to actually be appreciated for that? So I think that's what I'm looking at. How want to try to do it and explore reward systems with them, but then just embracing it for their entire organization.
Carie, I think you've said a really important thing there, is that it sounds like the leaders have emerged from really the same call to adventure that you make to the practitioners, that they actually are getting involved at the grass levels first, and then you discover that, wait a second, these are leaders. And I think that's super important. Not only do they actually have to practice it themselves, but even if it's mandated on high that we will do things differently, it actually has to be something that's internal in these people that makes them want to do it internally. We're a far way, I think, we're a far cry from structure being redetermined inside of these large enterprises that will sort of force this sort of behavior. We're still looking for the early adopters.
Yes, yeah, we are. And it's been a fascinating thing to kind of watch, because, I see the people who they come back to me and they say, I'm frustrated now, I can't do this, and you think they want to leave the company or something, but then you have the people who can really embrace it. And we've actually started to visualize and map kind of the ecosystem that we've created and the things that have spawned off of various events that we've done. and it's really fascinating. So hopefully I'll be putting that out there soon. I think it's going to be a really cool thing to see.
Nice.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you can say now that you've seen that that identifies that 10%? What makes those 10% of people who really get an idea and want to run with it, get the process? What is it about them?
What is it about them? You know, I think there are certainly always people who are what is it, constructively discontent, right? So they know there's a better way, and maybe they just haven't been exposed to it yet, and then suddenly they find this, and it's sort of like, this is exactly what I've been waiting for. And maybe they have a challenge that's facing them immediately that they can apply it to. I think that also has something to do with it. You know, if you can appreciate the methods, but maybe you don't work on things that, or maybe you don't have any sort of position in the company where you're able to implement it instantly. So it's kind of been a mix of those two things for sure. But there's just something, you know, there's something in these people that I haven't been able to put my finger on because they are slightly different, but you've like awakened something in them. I think it was latent. It was a latent need, perhaps.
I think that's exactly right. Leading up to this, somebody tweeted that these large enterprises, you know, breed out people with, maybe we can just call it the entrepreneurial spirit. And while I think that it's maybe squashed a little bit for a while, I actually don't think it's completely breeded out. I think these people are there, and so it's a message of empowerment and maybe a little bit of a safety net that gets these people to come out of the woodwork, and then they're really gung ho because it's exciting. It's you know, more interesting to work in that environment, and so there are people that are eager to do it inside of these large enterprises. There's just no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, Brant, your point earlier too, that they're there, but they may not have the title of leader or manager. And so finding them is part of the process here. That's really key. That's an interesting piece.
Well, I think it's finding them, but there's also, you know, Carie says there's 10% of these people that are actually going to do it, and I think it's the same thing with leaders. And a matter of fact, I would even differentiate between, you know, sort of developing new skills in leaders where they're able to use validated learning instead of return on investment, for instance, or leaders that can be coaches. There's, to me, I don't know what the right terminology is. I think that people use all these words differently. There's coaches and there's trainers, but I actually even think that there's a different class of people that are mentors, and these are people that are probably more senior, but they still sort of get it, and they're not focused necessarily on making this team win short term. They're focused on making this team functional and win longer term, that they are going to discover something in the future, even though this team might fail in the near term. And so it's the same thing I see out in the startup world. There's a lot of mentors that, you know, can kind of sit around and criticize how teams are doing and give a lot of advice, and we call them mentors. But the real special mentors are the ones that are able to, again, have empathy and teach these entrepreneurs, teach these innovation teams how to think differently, how to think better, how to run experiments, how to persevere and try to break down that wall, how to think of new experiments. It's really such a, it's amazing to me how much I see this analogy between the startup world and the innovation world inside of the large enterprise.
So that brings up all kinds of interesting questions. That role of a mentor who might be more senior and pushes people, teaches them how to learn, I think is what you were saying, teaches them how to experiment and how to keep going down that path. So first off, but what I wonder is, in a bigger organization, is part of the role of that person providing cover so that the teams that they're mentoring have room to fail, have room to behave in different ways than the organization is used to, or is that a different function?
I don't know, Carie, do you want to tackle that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, my dream would be if you had a leader who, you know, they've got their objectives that they've got to deliver for the year, but as a piece of that, they've got to sort of give a few teams or a few of their employees a chance to operate differently and explore some of these weird opportunities, let's say. And that, I think, in itself is the cover, because it needs to be, it's categorized as something different. Maybe it's development, so if it's development in the way of, let's just teach people how to work differently, they'll eventually be able to apply this to the the objectives that we have. By the way, maybe some of these weird things will actually become something cool. I mean, that's perhaps one way to look at it, because I think they're not, right now it seems so hard to resolve those two, because it is, you can't fail. We get objectives, you've got to deliver that thing. People spend so much time just justifying that the solution they've created is the right one. If you try to put this new process against that, I think it's just going to create a little bit of confusion for people. So it's like they've got to know this is another thing that they're working on, perhaps outside of their current objectives. I don't know. I mean, I think there's something to that. We haven't quite figured that out yet, but trying to experiment with it.
I always like to point out that if anybody claims to have already figured all this stuff out, they're not being completely truthful, because I really think these organizations are still, we're all trying to figure this out. It's sort of a new world. But I have an example just from last week, which to me was fascinating, where we were doing workshops for 5 days, and we had a bunch of teams that had sponsors who were not necessarily bought into the process, and they were supplying these teams with solutions. They really wanted these teams to go and build solutions, but the teams were actually supposed to be using this lean startup process. And intermingled with the actual workshop functions, senior leaders that were behind the process that we were teaching would come in and give these talks. And it was just absolutely extraordinary that I would go back to these teams and they would say, no, I have to just deliver what the sponsor wants. And I would keep on saying, do what these leaders that you've just listened to, do what they said. They have your back. They're creating this cover. And this one leader in particular was asked how she succeeded inside of this large enterprise. And she said, I succeeded by pushing back, by breaking the rules, by doing what I thought was going to create value. And it was extraordinary, because I could use that phrase the rest of the week, because she was really giving those teams permission to go and implement these lean startup processes for the outcome and not for the preordained solution. And it was beautiful, and it was just an amazing process. And then and at the end, the teams had all had this fear, right? And they got up and they presented their findings, and all of the sponsors were just blown away and loved it. And it was, a lot of the fear was inside the teams themselves and not in reality. And so I think that's cover helps that out, right? The teams have to feel in some sense that they have permission to do this, and then maybe some of that fear goes down and they're able to execute these lean startup principles, and then hopefully eventually we start seeing wins, and that'll create the momentum. But I actually think some amount of cover is essential. But I guess maybe, and this is sort of to Carie's point, that the cover is not going to be written in a memo that says, hey, I've got your back, and if you go do this, then I'm going to go and report to that person's boss. So it's not like this explicit cover. You have to use their words. You have to use the words of the leaders that are pushing for this.
Mm-hmm. I had another thought too. I think we've got these methods, right, of customers and assumptions. So a lot of times, some of the advice that I've been giving people lately is you have to list your manager and your organization as customers in something that you're trying to do, right? And then, what are your assumptions around that? Well, if I do this, I'll get fired. Okay, is that an assumption? Let's go see if we can do an experiment to validate or invalidate that. So I think that's something that can be really useful, because it's really it's a thing that you can't ignore. And I think it's really easy for people to just get angry and complain and say they can't beat the system. They're always going to be pushed into the existing processes. But those are little things that you can do to try to kind of infiltrate it, and like Brant was just saying, use their own words. So it's sort of, it's jujitsu,
I think that's exactly right. I love the concept of using the internal employees are your customers, your sponsors are your customers, and you can do customer development and you can run experiments there. And really, the traction that we see in successful enterprises that are sort of far down the path of implementing this, they get all of those internal functions on board. And again, not only like the leaders like Carie mentioned earlier, but HR and legal and compliance and finance. And all of these organizations can be brought into the process eventually. Yes, it's going to start with the product teams, it's going to start with the innovation teams, but the earlier that you can incorporate some of those people into the practices that you're doing and teach them to treat these internal innovation teams and internal product teams as customers, then they themselves can start acting like internal lean startups, and that it just creates all of this understanding and momentum around these new practices.
One thing I think is interesting that you mentioned, on the one hand, there's the idea of it's not going to be a memo, and on the other hand, we want to get all the functional teams aligned. There are companies that do use essentially a memo or a contract or a commitment letter where teams ask for certain resources. They ask for a certain amount of time. They ask for a certain amount of money. They ask for a certain shift in legal or accounting oversight in order to run an experiment. And that's something that everybody signs off on. We're going to use this experimental process. It's going to run for a certain amount of time. It's going to affect certain customers. And everybody does actually agree to that. It's in writing,
Right.
which I think is pretty interesting. It's a way to kind of tie some of those pieces, some of the language, some of the various functional teams you need to get aligned.
Yep, I'm guessing that's just a more advanced company, though. So, I mean, I think that those are enterprises that have figured it out to a certain realm where there's this tough middle part where you have the practitioners already doing it. You have the innovation teams or the product teams, and they're doing this. They're running the experiments, and there's a few leaders there. I guess I think that early on, there's not a process for having air cover. It's sort of once you've reached past this tipping point where air cover becomes part of the process itself.
Fair enough. I think that's true. It is. You're at a more advanced point when there's a document that people are
Exactly
signing.
right. Yep.
So one of the things I assume you need to get there, though, is some metrics. When we say we're holding people accountable and we want to be able to measure their success in experimentation, what is it that we're measuring? Carie, do you have examples that you use to help teams figure out what should we be measuring?
We've explored a few different things. So, one thing that I thought might be useful is, can we measure people's ability to use the tools or their proficiency in these methods? But then I've started to realize that where we do get the most traction is when people, say a brand team, for example, like Diet Coke. This is a real example. They just came to us and said, we need to engage our current Diet Coke drinkers that just love Diet Coke. We want to do some stuff. We want to come up with some ideas and do things differently, and put those in our innovation plan, like put those in our pipeline, our portfolio, stuff that we're going to work on. That's how they're measured. So it's like I could choose metrics, but it's actually based more specifically on the operating group, the function, or the business unit. Is it actually impacting the business? And I think that's where, no matter what I do, that's where it's going to get the most traction. So I haven't focused as much now on just trying to measure if people are getting it or not, and instead measuring reach and then how that turns into something that they're actually going to use to drive the business.
Interesting. Brant, do you want to speak to that?
Well, so the actual way we're going to measure these teams depends upon, again, what they're working on. And so, but I think what Carie said right there is the way to look at it. You look at impact. What is the impact that you're trying to have, and then work backwards to where you are now, and actually should provide some milestones along the way. And in the Lean Entrepreneur, I use the value stream discovery tool, which is a series of steps one can go through from your customer first becoming aware to them actually being passionate about whatever offering that you're making. And where you're focusing at first is the state of satisfying. So you're fulfilling the promise with a product or a service or a tool. You're fulfilling a very specific promise. And then how do I get these people so excited about this that they're sharing it with others, or giving testimonials or whatever is appropriate for that tool. And that's sort of a way to measure that I'm having now I'm ready to scale, right? It's sort of that old startup thing. If you could start seeing a little bit of organic growth, then you know you're onto something because you've got word of mouth going before you're even trying to get word of mouth. So I think measure back from impact, and what is it? The first step you're focusing on is really how do I achieve satisfaction? How do I fulfill this utility promise? Right? I am going to solve this problem with X, and then after that, how do I get the user experience or other elements necessary that people are enjoying it or fulfilling or having the impact that they're supposed to be having. How do I get that next? And then you should start seeing organic growth.
Brant, do you have a tool that you can share? I know, of course, client information is always proprietary, but can you give a concrete example?
Of could you be a little more specific, like around which part?
The being able to measure impact and work backwards to measuring progress in experimentation.
But like a product team or a...
Oh, I see. Yes, I was thinking of a product team specifically, yeah.
Okay. So again, I guess the example I'm thinking of is more on, probably more on the sustaining side, but there's still a lot to be taught here. But there was an international media company that we were working with who had a location in a very fun southern part of the world that we got to visit. So that was sort of a key bonus. But basically, they had 50% of the market. They were trying to move the needle of that organization and kind of go after their competitors there. And there was a number of teams that we incubated over 90 days, and each of them had their own part of the product that they were working on, and each of them had a different impact that they were supposed to make. And one was, people that were running ads go away. There's a large percentage of them go away after one ad. So can we increase the number of returns, right? So increase the amount of engagement with those customers. And then there was another one that said, are there other services that we can add on top of our ad selling? And then there was another one that was working on a third component. So each of those had a different impact, and we knew what that had to be. And so we could then break it down to the next level, which is, okay, what are the problems that we think that these customers might have in this one scenario, and we brainstorm the problems. We interview customers to get to know them more deeply, and then from that we can prioritize our leap of faith assumptions and start running experiments about it. And so over the period of 90 days, they've run an incredible number of experiments, a credible number of interviews, but also actually implementing minimum viable products in order to move the needle in a way that matches that impact that we were doing. And so in some of those cases, it really is more around satisfaction, like can we deliver an extra feature that's going to solve problem X? And in another case, it was really around what I sort of describe as passion. In other words, my functionality of placing an ad already does what it's supposed to do. So how do we increase this re-engagement, which is what I sort of call in my framework passion? And so the experiments they were running was, how do we get these people back multiple times, and what sort of additional either functionality, user experience, it could even be repositioning the product, right? So it could be marketing. It could be that the selling process itself needs to be benefit. So there's other areas inside the business model other than the technology that you can experiment and iterate on in order to increase this passion. And so both of those teams, 2 out of the 3 of the teams, actually moved the needle pretty significantly. The third one, not so much, but that's okay. And so once you uncover bottlenecks inside of a particular product line, there's just another bottleneck up the stream. And so these type of practices never end. It's just that now you move to a different problem statement. So hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, so one question about that, for those 3 teams, the one that wasn't as successful, do you think there was a leadership issue? Was the leader of that team Did that person behave in a different way than the two that were more successful?
So that's a great question. One of the teams that made a lot of progress, we had a switch of team leaders in between. The third team definitely not only struggled with the team leader, but also with their coach. And so this is really one of those things that started my thinking along this process, was that you can't just pick people as coaches or mentors, that there's a whole skill that needs to be developed there. And even once you find people that can coach, there's a whole nother finding the right person that can actually act as a mentor. And so I think that's a great point, Sarah. Yes, that was true.
Yeah, interesting. So where are leaders getting these skills? Carie, how do you guys think about that? At Coke, how do you think about developing leadership capacity for supporting experimentation and processes that probably your leaders themselves haven't used?
Yeah, something that was it was a surprise. It was a pleasant surprise, actually. I just heard that the entire marketing organization is now including entrepreneurial mindset as something that they're going to start, kind of rating people against, I guess you could say, in their performance plans. I think there's a lot. That's great that they're putting it in that, but I think there's also the thing where you have to be able to, they have to know what that looks like when they see it, and then the people who they're asking to do it have to know how to do it or be trained to do it. So I don't know how to identify those people. I think the way that I have, like I was saying earlier, I've only been able to sort of put this stuff out there and then see who kind of emerges as somebody who gets it and understands how to apply it. So I think the same thing is going to start to happen when we try to start rating people against, are they entrepreneurial or not. It's going to be pretty subjective to start. So I think that'll be a way maybe we could start to explore that and quantify it. But I wish I could answer that question.
Yeah, it'll be interesting when you do have a better sense, because it will start to teach you how you could train people for it, how you could develop the capacity.
Yeah, I'm going to keep thinking as this webinar is going. There's got to be something.
So one of the questions, we have a bunch of questions from the audience, and I want to start weaving some of those in. One of them is whether in big organizations can lean startup and other innovation processes start to get integrated into the day-to-day operations of the company, or when we think about innovation, is it something that needs to be in its own defined sandbox? Carie, how do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think that there's going to be a spectrum. So we already know how to do a lot of the stuff. Like if we're just trying to implement something that we always do, you can use waterfall methods, right? If you're exploring a new opportunity space, if it's something that looks like innovation in the way it currently arrives, as far as, is it a new package, is it new equipment, or is it a new beverage? Those things I think are going to be pretty easy to keep inside of the current, system and operating mechanisms. Something that I'm currently exploring is what happens when it looks a little bit different, and maybe it's a little bit outside of that, right? I'm actually in a startup accelerator myself. We've got a team with the Glesso vitamin water team. We're exploring a new product inside of that, and we've had a lot of those conversations about, we have to make sure that this is going to be able to come back into the company, but maybe, does it have to? Can we explore this thing sitting just outside of the company and bring it back in? Those are things that I think are going to be really interesting to try to figure out. We're going to take the next 5 months to do that, because the company isn't really set up to accept all things that again, don't look like, could very easily reject it, and that is one of the things where I was talking earlier. Our customer is the Coca-Cola company. So are we a business that's going to, hand itself over to Coca-Cola, or are we going to be a business that exists just outside of Coca-Cola?
Right, that's a great critical question to figure out over time. Yeah, Brant, how do you see companies approaching that issue?
Well, so I mentioned earlier about the innovation continuum. So I think that the day-to-day work benefits from these practices. I'm just not sure that they're called innovation practices anymore when it's inside the core business. But I think it's certainly important for the large enterprises. They already know this, right? The core business actually does need to be protected from all of these wacky, crazy experiments that an innovation team might be running. And so this gets back to, sort of the letters that you were talking about, the guidelines that internal teams or internal functions need to develop. But what we do find is that even in the day-to-day operations of a business, there are ways to improve. There's ways to move faster. And of course, lean, as in lean manufacturing, tackles a lot of that. But everybody loves to point out the jet engine, right? I mean, you don't need to innovate on the practices of building a jet engine on a daily basis. You can make them more efficient, and maybe there is some amount of experimentation that you can put into processes that are already known, right? If somebody really isn't doing, continuously doing split testing on their website or on their mobile app or any of these type of things, those are pretty sustaining activities, but you can use still experimentation. And there are people that really haven't brought their businesses into the digital age, and so there's a lot of things that they can still do on that front. And again, like I mentioned at the very start, people want to be able to move faster. The world is you have to be able to move at the speed of the internet, is what one customer said to me. So you've got customers that have choices. You have customers that have an incredible amount of knowledge about their problems in the marketplace and all of the alternatives to them. And so all organizations, I think, need to move faster, and you can use these principles to help you move faster, even if it's on the very, very sustaining side and maybe can't even call it properly innovation. So I guess that's how I'd answer that.
Right. All right. So one of the questions that we get, I think literally, Brant, I know you see this every time we have any conversation about innovation in established organizations, is how do you deal with the situation where you've got team members who are ready to go, or you have an innovation team or a set of them, or maybe it's people in the functional, day-to-day functional roles. They're excited to use more entrepreneurial techniques. They're excited to try lean startup or other methods, but they don't have buy-in from above. Or they have people who say, yes, of course we support innovation because everybody knows they're supposed to say that, but they don't really. How do you work in a essentially hostile environment?
Right. So I think I gave this answer last year when we talked about this, and I said number one is buy your C-suite a copy of Eric's book is step one. But I actually encourage. I think Carie probably actually has a better answer to this because it's what she's done. I mean, I think what you're doing is you're finding like-minded people. So I've even suggested go on meetup.com and create an internal meetup for your organization and find like-minded people, and out of that group hopefully you're going to find a handful of leaders actually that are in that group. So that's one idea, but you're treating your organization as the customer, and now you need to start running experiments to see how you can unearth this. And then the second thing is to start running experiments. Do it in your day-to-day work. Do it off hours, maybe even take a small project that is low risk and start running experiments. The quicker that you can start providing evidence to your managers, evidence to your leaders, you're actually training them to evaluate projects in a different way. So instead of just simply, focusing the method, focus on the outcomes and start presenting leadership. And to me, that's the first way of starting to get leaders. Wow. I mean, are they really, if you can show them customer engagement in some experiment that you were talking about or that you ran, I think that they're going to respond to that. So part of it is, you can't be too afraid of what you think your leaders are going to react. You have to actually get them to react, right? Or else you're paralyzed.
Right. That's perfectly put. Please, Carie, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that I would encourage anyone who sort of says they're working in a hostile environment to do what we were kind of talking about earlier, right? So your manager has stuff that they're trying to do. How can you, kind of dig down into that, understand what it is that their objectives are, maybe inside of what you're trying to accomplish, as well as what are their immunities. So something that we're looking at in the accelerator that I'm in is this concept of immunities to change. So there are assumptions that they have around working this way as well. So if you start to understand what it is that they're worried about, you can address those in the way that you approach, working in this new way, and continue to treat them as a customer and somebody whose needs and pains you have to also meet. So I would just see that as an opportunity. I know it's easier said than done, but I love what Brant was saying too about, and this is actually what we've been doing. So with our, the events that we put on, it gives people the opportunity to work with like-minded people who want to work this way, explore an opportunity together. And, at the end of 2 or 3 days, you've got this new sort of set of people that get you and you get each other, and maybe you're exploring something. And perhaps you go and you take it to a different leader in the company altogether. So we've seen that happen a few times where out of a few of the startup weekends that we've run here, there's a team that comes up with an idea that has nothing to do with the thing that they work on in their day job, and they go out and they find a senior sponsor who's in a completely different organization and function, who's maybe one of those believers, they want to be in on the front end of something kind of cool. So they sponsor them and they give them a little bit of money, and it's just super inspiring for everybody else too.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I love that. Well, that actually brings up from our attendees, people are asking about how do you work across silos? Some of those seemingly deliberate barriers that might be in place to keeping people, to getting people collaborating. And Carie, you just talked about finding people in the organization who might be able to provide some support. But I think there's also another level of how do you create a cross-functional team that can build something when you might have folks who are in marketing don't really have any touch with people who are in product development or in sales. Is there anything in particular that you do at Coke that helps bring people together across departments?
Well, I guess there are a couple of things. I mean, the events that we do where we just give people, so it is the startup weekends that we do, but we do a few other things that are similar. The way that we advertise those is it's sort of open for anyone to attend, right? And we reach out to different functions, all the functions that we can even think of, so that we do have that diversity of thought. And the way that we tell people to form teams is we say don't be with your friends. Obviously, don't be with people who are like you. You really need different skill sets to do what you need to do in 2.5 days. And then we also teach like a 1-day course on some of these methods. And one of the big things that we have discovered, it's something that Janice and Jason Frazier taught us about, is a balanced team. We went into a lot of depth with them about it, but it's how can you implement a 3-person team where that's really where you're going to be firing on all cylinders? And so when we present that to people, certainly they raise all the challenges of, well, I'm on a team of 10 people, or we're a very consensus-driven organization, and it's one of those things that we've tried to figure out a way to tell people, what if you go back to your manager, your team, and you say, all right, this is how we're going to operate from now on. What are the risks associated with that? What if you just do it? So it's something that we're also suggesting that people experiment with.
Right, interesting. So one of the things that's implicit in that, of course, is they're coming from different departments. They're going to have different reporting structures, different goals, different things that they're held accountable for. Is that one of the things that they tend to raise? Like, we're not all measured the same way. How do we get aligned?
It's usually project-based. So I don't know if I don't know that it's different at Coke. But if you've got an objective of develop a new beverage, typically you do need a brand manager or a business manager type person, someone in charge of technical feasibility and someone in charge of the consumer insight and the customer insight. So all of those people would be managed at a high level on did they deliver the project, which is also unfortunate. It's not actually, I think, what we need to be doing. But I think everybody's got their own agendas of what they think they need to achieve in their work environment and how their manager starts to look at them. So those, I think, are some of the hidden things that Some people might raise, but generally I think everyone would say, yeah, we're all on board to deliver this thing. But that's where the risk comes in, because people don't voice those, I think, as much.
Yeah, right. So part of the leadership role is flushing, being able to see where there might be those issues and providing some level ground.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to get back, there's some more questions from the audience, but I also do want to get back to the leadership question, which is why we're here. Brant, earlier at the very beginning of the webcast, you had talked about one of the roles for a mentor would be to help teams push and think about when do we experiment more, when do we pivot, when do we persevere. You have told me in other contexts that one of the things you see a lot in enterprise teams is that they want to pivot very quickly, that they tend to hit the pivot moment long before people would in a traditional standalone startup. I wonder if you can talk about where you think that comes from, what that looks like, where does it come from, and what's the role of leaders in shaping people's thinking around that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I guess I'm not sure that I know, but I'm wondering if because failure is a bad thing, or it could be a couple different things. Maybe they take fail fast too literally, right? So, some of the buzzwordology around lean innovation and around lean startup, people don't necessarily get all those things right depending on how they learned about them. So the way I try to teach it is that you pivot when you're done iterating. And so we don't want to use pivot in place of the word iterate, but you pivot when you've actually run through really all of the experiments that you can really run through in order to validate or invalidate an idea. But I think what happens maybe inside of some of these organizations is that at the first sign of failure, they think it's better to drop out and go, oh, I better go find it. Like they want to, they're searching for validation as quickly as possible so they're not perceived as having failed. I think if it's a sponsor idea, they probably aren't leave too early because they do feel like they need to work as hard as they can to get the outcome that the sponsor wants. But I think when they're internal ideas or there's a range of ideas that they're choosing from, they're really quickly in search of the one that they think that they can latch onto because there's some amount of evidence for it, and so they're spinning all over the place as opposed to, out in the startup world, typically, you're really trying to break that wall down. So you're persevering as hard as you can and making sure that you're looking at all the angles and did you really run a thorough number of experiments and did you think of this or did you think of that or maybe it's the wrong customer. Or there's just a number of ways that then a mentor can try to tease that out and try to rally the troops and try to get them to go back in and think harder and try to figure it out and run new experiments and come up with new ideas. I think it's even similar to, I think, the whole discussion about having your back, having the team's back. I think it's that they need to be able to go through the process in a mindful way because they know that there's going to be a number of failures throughout the process, even before the project fails completely, right? So I mean that's the tough part, right? If the longer I stay in and I see failures, are they going to tell me that I didn't fail fast enough? I don't know. It's an interesting dynamic, but I think it really comes down to we want to get the teams to persevere until they've exhausted, whatever that is, right? I mean it's what I also call out in the startup. It's the art of entrepreneurship. There is no blueprint. There is no roadmap that says, yep, it's time to move on. If you're a scientist in the lab and you run, do you run 100 experiments? Do you run 500 experiments before your hypothesis fails? So I think it's part of the art of entrepreneurship to figure out, when to pivot, when to move on. But I think that we, as leaders, we want to encourage people to go through the process and to try to break through that wall because it maybe that innovation, maybe that breakthrough innovation is right on the other side of that wall.
Yeah, something we just saw last week actually was a team who gave up really quickly when they found that someone else was already working on it. And that was also a moment of like heavy coaching around, you guys could actually go and do it better, and what's taking them so long, and why don't you embrace this opportunity to, you know, really blow this thing out of the water. So, I mean, they were ready to just, they were like, well, somebody's already doing it, so we're not going to do it anymore.
Yeah.
Were you able to turn them around?
Yes, we were. So it was a kind of a win, yeah.
Well, think about the startup world, right? There's thousands of startups working on the same idea, and in today's day and age, that's the way it should be. When you're designing for user experiences, especially, there's actually going to be multiple solutions. There's not, you know, sort of the old, you know, the 90s or early 2000s best of breed, you know, kind of wiping out all the competition, I think is over. I think that there's a lot of market segments out there that need solutions that are tailored to their particular needs and their particular situations. And so, to me, it's a positive that you've got multiple teams trying to figure out solutions.
All right. So one of the things that people always wonder is, what are the tools that you need inside an organization to support innovation? We had somebody ask about, you know, whether social networking tools internally help support. But I wonder, is there anything that's particular to experimentation that you guys have found useful?
Well, I'm a big fan of analog tools, and it really it's a throwback again to lean manufacturing. And Toyota, when they had come and observed the automobile manufacturers in the West, they were kind of like, wow, you know, the Americans are obsessed with tools. And I think that there's truth to that. And there's all of these digital tools that are coming up, and that's all great, you know, for teams that are ready to use them. I think that's awesome. But I think that I like the analog tools. I like the teams standing up around a poster or a whiteboard and working on assumptions together and prioritizing things together. And in the end, having the leaders be able to show the progress of the team. Here's the experiments that were run. Here's the assumptions that we started out with. Here's the evidence. Here's the data, so that we can make decisions on data. And so I don't really care if what tools people use. I think, you know, Eric always has said, you know, pen and a piece of paper actually work pretty well. So I'm in agreement with that, except that I like the whiteboards or the experiment maps or the things that can be shared, standing up in a room with a leader right there, where you're able to tell a story based upon evidence.
Yeah, I think I would absolutely agree. It's hard for me to imagine how to automate some of this stuff, and I think people would love to hear that there's, you know, some tools that you can use like that. But, you know, I started to think about some of the things that are the hardest to learn. So the interview techniques and customer development, I think, are the things that just require practice. And you know, the tools that you can use to try to get yourself more interviews, perhaps, is one thing. You know, so if you want to use Mechanical Turk to get yourself a lot of phone calls, but I just think, you know, practice in those types of things, physically doing things together, is really the only way to learn this stuff and get better at it.
Carie, before we hopped on the webcast, you had mentioned the idea that leaders perhaps should fund stuff that sounds weird and terrible. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that I've heard anecdotally, you know, some leader, maybe it's Google, and I'm not quite sure, but, you know, they will unilaterally fund ideas that sound weird and maybe outside of what they are used to seeing and hearing as innovation for their company. And, you know, I'm not sure the reason for that, but I think if that were me doing it, it would be because it encourages people to explore things that they're passionate about. It also maybe cuts down on the risk involved in it. You know, if it sounds like it's a little bit outside of things, maybe it's safer to pursue. But then the opportunity for it to be something big could be greater. Let's say if it is something that it is outside of what we normally do, maybe it becomes a way that we disrupt ourselves. So, you know, it might be just a way to make it seem a little bit safer to do too. It seems backwards to think about it that way, but, you know, it's just we're giving people some runway to explore things that they're just passionate about.
You know, I think the language is important. You know, so it's important in every organization, and it's different in every organization. People use different terms to talk about experimentation, to talk about MVPs or minimum viable products, to talk about runway and taking risk and trying things. And if part of the language is we're going to try something terrible sounding and weird, and that works in your organization, that's fantastic. If that makes people feel like it's a safer space to do something that might otherwise be hemmed in by more conventional expectations. I think that's like every organization has to figure out what it is, and you may not have the department of terrible and weird ideas. There may be some different language you use, but in fact, having some humor around it sometimes helps too. Giving people a little bit of space to think in a different way is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I like that.
All right, so we've got just a couple more minutes, and I want to just give a chance to each of you to answer one more question and for closing thoughts. So this is a big picture kind of question. Somebody asked early on in our attendee chat here, what prevents behavior change in organizations? And I would love to hear, if there's something that you guys feel like, okay, I've kind of identified this is the source of it. But in particular, because we're talking about leadership today, how do you think about leaders? How do they get in the way of preventing it, and what can we do about that?
Well, I can start. I think that it's sort of Brant mentioned earlier, the innovator's dilemma, and as much of a cliche as that might sound, it's sort of true. There's a business model that we have limited resources that we need, and we want to put as much against that as possible to just continuing to operate that existing business model. So when anything, takes resources away from that aren't going to deliver the most value seemingly in the short term, that keeps the company from being as innovative as possible, and it also keeps the people for delivering against the current business model from trying other things. So it's, those are the things I think you do have to. You've got to change reward systems, but it's very hard to fight against. We make the most money doing X. Let's not put money against doing X. That's a really hard conversation to have.
Yeah. Brant, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's. Again, it's going to depend on how an organization evolves. If you can get the C-suite to declare that, hey, we are going to do things different, and then, ideally they put some of the rewards to back that up. I'd like to say, if we could get the senior leadership, the very senior leadership, to tell their business unit managers that you have to justify not spending 10% of your budget, for example, on crazy innovation experiments, then just a simple declaration like that and then holding to it actually will change this very quickly, because now their performance is going to be measured on running experiments, and as long as we're optimizing the performance around revenue, then you're incenting managers to maximize the return on investment, which is going to lead back to the sustaining innovation. It's just, we see this, it's just been a constant for decades now. So I think part of it is also that leaders are educated this way. So again, these large enterprises became successful because they learned how to execute into this market with these known products. That's how the company got big. That's where the margins are. That's where the market is. And so not only it's not like a sustaining innovation in that way. It's really not a pejorative at all. It's where startups would love to be, right? It means that you're large and successful. And so we also have to, when we're talking about all this lean innovation stuff, lean startup stuff, we have to acknowledge that core business is super important. Pitney Bowes is a very innovation-oriented culture. They know a lot about innovation. They can see that this huge mailroom equipment market is declining. People spend a lot less money year over year on mailing equipment. It's still a multi-billion-dollar industry, so it's not like you want to take that core business and turn it into a startup. No, you fully realize that core business needs to continue to execute. So the key is can you get those leaders to take a certain percentage of start running experiments outside of their local maximum in order to make this company survive another 100 years or another 200 years. And so I think that sort of vision really has to come down from the very top. We are going to do things in a different way. We're going to innovate differently. And I think that on the complete other side, if your senior leaders aren't that way, then I really believe this lean innovation is only going to go so far. But if that's what you want to do inside your organization, and I think you should, you need to just start doing it. You need to start training your managers and your managers' managers using evidence, and that means running experiments. It means finding like-minded people and develop the skills upward. And really, it requires both. It's a sandwich play here.
All right. Well, on that note, Brant, that's an excellent way to wrap this up. We've just hit the hour mark. So thank you both so much, and thank you to the attendees for asking great questions. Brant, we will look forward to seeing you at the Lean Startup Conference. Brant is leading a full-day workshop about introducing Lean Startup principles into your corporation on December 9th. And Carie, thank you so much for joining us from Atlanta and sharing a little bit of the inside of Coca-Cola. It was fascinating.
Sure. Thank you, guys. That was great.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Carie.
Take care.
See you guys.
And thanks to everyone for joining us today. This wraps up our show. Visit leanstartup.co for more information on the Lean Startup Conference, December 8 to 12 in San Francisco. Bye, everyone.